Good morning. It's so good to be with you again, even by camera. Uh, and as we come this morning to look at the theme of God puts all things and all the pieces back together again, it reminds me of the nursery rhyme years ago, of course, of Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's, of course, the simple version. I'm sure there are other more humorous pieces that go along with that. But what we're going to take a look at today is the crisis that we encounter in our lives, the crisis that the disciples encountered with the death of Jesus prior to their real, true experience of the resurrection and prior to the events of Pentecost. The account in Luke of the disciples on the road to Emmaus is a historical teaching, if you will, on Christians in the face of crisis. Really for anyone in the face of crisis, but especially for the followers of Jesus. And this story highlights some of the attitudes and some of the actions that are characteristic of our experience in the midst of difficulty on the road with Jesus. It is a picture, if you will, kind of a snapshot of that fallen apartness of humanness, the flaws and shortcomings that lead us down familiar blind alleys and into a certain amount of discouragement and even sometimes despair. And it's worth seeing these pitfalls and having an understanding of these things and seeing some of the solutions and some of the things that will help us to understand that just as we are in crisis, so we are in a situation that affords God the opportunity to give us provision, give us a sense of presence in the midst of those challenges that we face. So if we follow the text, we begin to notice certain things that come to light. For instance, in the very beginning it says, now on the same day, two of them were going to the village. This is on the same day that they heard the women's story about Jesus not being found in the tomb. And let us note from the very outset that these disciples get stuck. They're not able to investigate the potential of Jesus' resurrection because they are stuck in the depressing moment that they are in. They don't accept immediately what the women have told them. So that in spite of the potential good news of the resurrection, in spite of that, the very same day, they take off and they begin this trip back to the place where they are familiar, perhaps, Emmaus. And in the course of this trip, Jesus himself joins them on the road, and we discover from the description that is given to us that they are downcast. He is asking them, why are you in this state? And they are downcast. And then they have this discussion with him, not recognizing Jesus and saying, are you the only person who doesn't know what's been going on? So realize this, that in the face of this crisis, there is a paralyzation, a paralysis that takes place, where the potential understanding of reality, the potential recognition of facts is clouded. And the disciples are essentially paralyzed and unable to move into an area of resolution. Notice that this, I think, goes along with our tendency in life when we are faced with a catastrophe or when we are faced with a difficulty, for us to see those things as much bigger than they are. Superlative words enter into our vocabulary. This was the worst thing. This was the most dreadful thing. This is the loneliest that I have been. There are these perceptions that elevate this set of circumstances to the penultimate of our human experience. Notice that there is a false perception of reality. There is a conclusion that is essentially jumped to that disallows the presence of Jesus. They rule out the women's account. You notice the end of that account. It says they noticed the tomb was empty, but the disciples say, but they did not see Jesus. In other words, they're denying any kind of resurrection at that point in their experience. This false perception is the kind of thing which is the enemy of our living and finding God's provision in the midst of crisis. What would have happened, for instance, if we look at the incident of David and Goliath? The familiar story of David and Goliath, where David has been sent by God as God's provision to defeat this huge Philistine who was terrorizing the army of Israel. And he shows up on the front. And now you have all of the Israelites and the people in charge who are shuddering and quaking in their boots before this Philistine. And immediately notice all of the things which are present in that scenario. David's abilities are immediately doubted. His very presence there is called into question. Once his presence is there allowed, everybody seeks to provide for him. They give him Saul's armor, which does not fit. They have their ideas about how things should happen, which are completely removed from the reality of God's provision in this particular confrontation between David and Goliath. And ultimately, what takes place is that in spite of, not with the assistance of the Israelites, in spite of them, David goes out, takes his few stones, and the rest, of course, is history. It is really lucky for the disciples that the walk to Emmaus, the trip to Emmaus, took more than one day. Because during the next couple of hours, Jesus spends a huge amount of time with them, unpacking the prophets and unpacking the events of recent days, and calling their attention intellectually to these things to say to them, look, do you understand? Do you understand how things are how your perception of reality is warped, and how the truth of what has occurred has not seeped into your intellect, into your understanding of what's taken place. I think that modern day psychologists would probably call this reality therapy, where one confronts the unreal or the perceived reality with the truth of the situation. And it is, I think, helpful for us to note as we look at this series of things, because there are hidden in this discussion clues, and there are strategies which can help us in our own difficulties and challenges that we face. Things that Jesus desires and things that Luke wanted to share with us that will help us in our experience in following Jesus through the valleys of what it is to be a disciple. The first of these pieces of reality that enters into the situation, the first evidence of reality defeating fiction, if you will, is that Jesus begins by telling them the facts from the gospel narratives and from the history of events. It reminds me of, and the perception which is being corrected, it reminds me of that little phrase that is printed on the bottom of the side mirrors on most vehicles. That little inscription says, objects may appear further away than they actually are. Or converse. Objects are closer than they appear. If we take that and look at the situation of reality, what that warning is telling us is that our sensual presences, our perceptions of reality, are being fooled by some of the circumstances, and that we should be cautious about that. You see, our decision-making ability needs to be assisted. It needs to be informed, oriented towards reality. Hence, in this situation, Jesus enters the picture. But how often have you found, I know that I have, that it's a good idea to get another person's opinion on something? How does this look to you? My mom and dad they were great cooks, and they enjoyed cooking together. My dad wrote a recipe book, and he titled it "Skinny Cooks Are Not to Be Trusted." And one of them, I can still remember them in the kitchen together, where occasionally they would be making a broth or some dish, and one would ask the other, "How does this taste to you?" And isn't that a good thing for us to do in terms of the relationships that we are called to have as followers of Jesus? Our relationships with God, our relationships with one another, invite us to invite others to be a part of the reality and the struggles and the challenges that we face. From the very beginning of history, God is desiring this restored relationship. God is desiring to provide for his followers. God is desiring to help us to answer questions, to help us to have hope in the midst of difficulty. This, of course, is the whole central feature of the 23rd Psalm, a psalm of hope that talks about God walking with us and guiding us through the valley of the shadow of death, that we will fear no evil because thou art with me. Read that psalm. Memorize that psalm, because it is an accurate reality check for us on the presence of God. I am convinced that if it was necessary, Jesus would have gone on with the disciples for a second day, perhaps all the way to Emmaus. But an interesting thing took place, that as they invited Jesus to stay, because obviously they were receiving some encouragement from him, and although it appeared he would go on beyond them, he stayed with them, and they broke bread together. And in the breaking of that bread together, which of course is an obvious allusion to the communion service, the meal of the Last Supper, a familiar thing which they had done over and over again. In the breaking of the bread together, the identity of Jesus was made known to the disciples. And all of a sudden, just as Paul, the scales falling from his eyes, so reality broke in on the disciples, and they recognized Jesus. And in the midst of that understanding, that new revelation, that new provision of God, that new understanding that Jesus was with them, they allowed their intellect, they allowed everything that they had perceived to re-inform them. Did not our hearts burn within us as he opened the scriptures to us on the road? They went back in their memory and they rehearsed through the various bits and pieces of the puzzle that God had now begun to put together and was now completing in their midst. And the truth of who Jesus was, their Lord and Savior resurrected, was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is a marvelous picture of the way in which God puts things all back together again for us when they are broken. I am one of those clumsy sorts of people in life who occasionally breaks things, and I know that I have made it a task of mine to put things back together again like perhaps the table full of violins that you saw at the beginning of this time together. It takes work, it takes experience, it takes a knowledge and an understanding, but above all, it takes a perception of reality and a perception that there is someone who's looking out for us. And may I share this with you as we face the challenges of this week. That the disciples turned around, packed themselves up, and headed back to Jerusalem to be with the disciples. And they were there for the day of Pentecost, which would come not that much further down the road. And this is God's desire for us, that we would turn around and in the face of crisis, embrace the God who is there to provide for us moment by moment. And may this be true for us this coming week in the challenges that we face together following Jesus.